Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1893, and deep within the forested highlands of the Ozark Mountains, where sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy of ancient oak and hickory, stood a peculiar dwelling that would later become the center of one of the region's most disturbing historical accounts. Along a forgotten trail that once connected the small settlements of Jasper and Hasty, Arkansas, travelers occasionally spoke of encountering an unusual sight, a massive hollowed-out oak stump, nearly 15 feet in diameter, with crude windows cut into its weathered surface and smoke rising from a metal pipe protruding from its moss-covered roof. This was the home of the Walker sisters, Evangeline, Meredith, and Imogene, 3 women whose isolated existence and unusual practices would eventually become the subject of whispered conversations throughout the region. County records from Harrison, Arkansas indicate that the Walker family originally settled in the area around 1868, having migrated from eastern Tennessee following the Civil War. The patriarch, Josiah Walker, had acquired a modest parcel of land and attempted farming, but the rocky soil of the Ozark Highlands proved unforgiving. By 1880, census documents show only Josiah and his 3 adult daughters remaining on the property, his wife having succumbed to an unspecified fever in the winter of 1877. The daughters were noted in local church registries as attending services sporadically until 1885, after which their names no longer appeared in any community records. According to accounts published in the Harrison Daily Times in 1966, based on interviews with elderly residents who recalled the period, Josiah Walker had been a solitary man with a reputation for unusual beliefs. One interview subject, Silas Burnett, then 93, recalled, "Old man Walker weren't like regular folk. Always talking about signs and portents, said the land spoke to him. After his woman passed, he grew stranger still, started digging out that big stump after lightning struck it, said it was meant to be a sanctuary." The massive oak that would become the Walker sisters' dwelling had reportedly been struck by lightning in the spring of 1882. Instead of clearing the dead wood, Josiah, with the help of his daughters, began the painstaking process of hollowing out the enormous stump. The interior was reportedly carved out using hand tools, axes, adzes, and burning coals over the course of several months. By winter, the family had moved from their deteriorating cabin into the stump house. Local speculation at the time suggested that Josiah believed the structure would protect them from what he described as atmospheric disturbances that he claimed were causing his increasing headaches and episodes of disorientation. What few outsiders who had occasion to enter the stump dwelling during Josiah's lifetime later described an interior that was surprisingly spacious, with the walls carved smooth and treated with some kind of resin that Josiah had formulated himself. This resin, according to Burnett's recollection, gave off a peculiar odor like pine sap mixed with something medicinal, and seemed to preserve the wood from decay. The floor had been dug out and leveled, then covered with flat stones carefully fitted together. A central fire pit with a metal hood directed smoke up through the pipe that emerged from the roof. Around the perimeter were built-in benches and shelves, all carved directly from the remaining wood of the stump. Most unusual, according to those who glimpsed it, was the network of small channels or grooves carved into the interior walls. When asked about their purpose, Josiah reportedly explained that they were designed to direct the energies within the dwelling. Several visitors noted that these channels seemed to form patterns resembling anatomical drawings of the circulatory system, though none made this observation to Josiah himself, finding his intense gaze and abrupt manner too disconcerting to invite further conversation. Josiah Walker's name appears on a death certificate dated November 3, 1891, listing natural causes as the reason for his passing. Following their father's death, the Walker sisters remained in the Stump house, becoming increasingly isolated from the already sparse community. Their rare appearances in nearby settlements were noteworthy enough to be recalled decades later by those who had encountered them. Martha Hopkins, interviewed in 1969 for an oral history project, described seeing the sisters at the general store in Jasper in the summer of 1892. Those Walker women would come maybe twice a year for supplies. Always wore identical dresses they'd sewn themselves, long dark things regardless of the season. Wouldn't look folks in the eye. Paid with herbs and such. Some folks said the herbs worked better than the doctor's medicines. According to store ledgers preserved in the County Historical Society, the sisters' purchases were unusual for the time. While most families bought staples like flour, coffee, sugar, and ammunition, the Walkers acquired primarily salt in large quantities, glass bottles of various sizes, chemical substances, including alcohol, lime, and something recorded as preservative powder, and metal tools, particularly small, precise implements like awls, fine-tooth saws, and narrow blades. The ledgers also show that in August 1892, they purchased 3 identical journals with leather bindings and brass locks, paying an unusually high price that the shopkeeper had specially ordered from Little Rock. Local postmaster Gerald Cunningham, whose records were meticulously kept and preserved, noted that between January and August 1893, the Walker sisters received an unusual number of packages from destinations as distant as Chicago, St. Louis, and even London, England. The contents were never declared, but Cunningham recalled that several packages bore return addresses from medical supply companies, and one from an antiquarian bookseller known for dealing in rare scientific texts. In his private diary, discovered after his death in 1912, Cunningham wrote that the final package delivered to the Walker sisters in late August 1893 was unusually heavy for its size and dripped a dark fluid that smelled of chemicals onto his counter, causing him to wrap it in an oilcloth before delivery. The first hints of something unusual occurring at the Walker Stump house came in early 1893 when a local hunter named Samuel Pruitt reported a strange encounter to the county sheriff. According to the official report preserved in county archives, Pruitt had been tracking a wounded deer when he found himself near the Walker property at dusk. He described hearing a sound like no natural thing, neither animal nor wind, but a sort of wailing chant, coming from the direction of the Stump house. Curiosity overcoming caution, he approached close enough to observe the 3 sisters moving in a circle around a fire outside their dwelling, swaying in unison and speaking or singing in what he described as no language I ever heard tell of. The report noted that Pruitt left immediately, feeling he had witnessed something not meant for outside eyes. What Pruitt did not include in his official statement, but later confided to his brother, as recorded in family papers donated to the Arkansas Historical Society in 1978, was that he had observed something hanging above the fire, something he initially took to be a deer carcass, being prepared for smoking, but which he realized with growing horror had a shape too like a man's to be any forest animal. He admitted that the fading light and distance prevented him from being certain of what he'd seen, and his fear of being accused of spreading falsehoods kept him from including this detail in his report to authorities. Throughout the spring and summer of 1893, travelers on the nearby trail reported hearing similar sounds on nights when the moon was full. Local suspicion and curiosity grew, but the deeply ingrained Ozark tradition of minding one's own business prevented any direct intervention. However, by late August, a more disturbing pattern began to emerge. Livestock began disappearing from farms within a 5-mile radius of the Walker property. First chickens, then goats, and eventually a calf. While predators were common in the area, the animals vanished without traces of blood or signs of struggle that would typically accompany a wolf or mountain lion attack. Merlin Hawkins, whose farm lost 2 goats and a prized rooster during this period, later told investigators that he had found small, precise incisions on a partially eaten goat carcass discovered at the edge of his property. Cuts that seemed too clean to have been made by animal teeth or claws. When he mentioned this observation to neighbors, they dismissed his concerns, suggesting that perhaps another farmer had slaughtered the animal and it had been subsequently scavenged. Hawkins remained unsettled by the discovery, but did not pursue the matter further. On September 12, 1893, a local man named Ezekiel Harden reported that his brother Joseph had failed to return from a hunting trip in the vicinity of Buffalo River, not far from the Walker property. A search party was organized, but after 3 days yielded no sign of the young man. Most participants returned to their farms and responsibilities. Only the brother and 2 close family friends continued searching. According to a sworn statement given by Ezekiel Harden on October 2, 1893, preserved in county court records, the men had expanded their search area and found themselves near the Walker Stump house at nightfall on September 17th. Approaching to ask if the sisters had seen any sign of Joseph, they were struck by an unusual odor emanating from the dwelling, described by Harden as sickly sweet, like meat gone to turning, but with something else, something that burned the nose. When their calls received no response, the men cautiously approached the structure. What they discovered inside the Stump house would become the subject of contradictory accounts and increasingly elaborate local legends over the subsequent decades. The official report, filed by Sheriff Thomas Ledbetter after investigation, states only that evidence of unusual practices incompatible with civilized behavior was found, along with personal effects believed to belong to Joseph Harden. The report further noted that the Walker sisters were not present at the dwelling, and that a warrant was issued for their questioning in connection with Harden's disappearance. A more detailed account emerges from private correspondence between Sheriff Ledbetter and the county judge, discovered in an archive donation in 1967. In this letter, dated September 25, 1893, Ledbetter describes the interior of the Stump house as having been divided into 3 distinct areas: a living space with crude furniture, a storage area containing preserved foods and herbs, and a 3rd section curtained off from the rest. Behind this curtain, he reported finding a table stained dark with what appears to be dried blood, various cutting implements, and a collection of small bone fragments that he believed to be human. Most disturbing was the discovery of a handwritten ledger containing what Ledbetter described as rituals and incantations of a most disturbing nature, along with detailed anatomical drawings showing various dissections. The letter goes on to describe glassware of unusual design containing liquids of various colors and consistencies, carefully labeled in a script that Ledbetter found difficult to decipher. He noted that many labels included dates, measurements, and what appeared to be names. Most troubling to the sheriff was a series of glass containers arranged in a specific pattern on a shelf, each holding what appeared to be preserved organic material suspended in clear fluid. Though Ledbetter's description is vague, his discomfort is evident in his closing remarks to the judge. "I have seen the aftermath of violence both in war and in my capacity as sheriff, but nothing has disturbed my peace of mind as greatly as what I observed in that place. I believe it would be in the community's best interest if the full details were not made public." Among Joseph Harden's personal effects found at the scene were his hunting knife, a distinctive hand-tooled leather belt that his brother positively identified, and fragments of clothing that matched what he had been wearing when last seen. No definitive evidence of his fate was discovered, though a subsequent, more thorough search of the surrounding area uncovered a freshly disturbed patch of earth approximately 50 yards behind the Stump house. When excavated, this site yielded only animal bones, primarily chicken and goat, buried together with various herbs and what appeared to be personal items. buttons, a lock of hair tied with string, and a small wooden carving weathered with age. The manhunt for the Walker sisters that followed was extensive by the standards of the time, involving lawmen from 3 counties and numerous civilian volunteers. Despite searching the surrounding wilderness for weeks, no trace of the women was found. Local newspapers reported on the case initially, but coverage quickly faded as no new developments emerged. By November 1893, the search had been officially abandoned, and the case remained technically open, but inactive. One of the most puzzling aspects of the sisters' disappearance was how 3 women, presumably on foot, could have evaded such an extensive search in rugged terrain. Local speculation included suggestions that they had prepared escape routes in advance, perhaps maintaining a hidden cabin deeper in the mountains. Others whispered that the women had connections to remote communities rumored to exist in the most inaccessible regions of the Ozarks, groups that had deliberately separated themselves from wider society and were known to harbor those fleeing from authorities. The Stump house itself was destroyed in early October 1893, burned to the ground on the orders of Sheriff Ledbetter, ostensibly to prevent it from becoming a destination for the morbidly curious. This action, undertaken without judicial authorization, later became a point of controversy, as it effectively destroyed most physical evidence related to the case. Ledbetter defended his decision in a newspaper interview, claiming the structure contained influences unwholesome to the community, and that its destruction was necessary for public moral hygiene. What the newspaper account did not mention, but was later revealed in Ledbetter's personal journal made public by his grandson in 1975, was that the sheriff had removed certain items from the Stump house before ordering its destruction. These included several of the journals kept by the sisters, a collection of unusual glass vials, and what he described as a map unlike any I have seen, showing not geographical features, but what appears to be channels or pathways within the human form, marked with symbols and annotations. Ledbetter claimed to have sealed these items in a metal box and buried them at a location known only to himself, intending that they never again see the light of day. In the absence of the sisters' capture or a definitive resolution to the case, local speculation flourished about what had actually transpired at the Walker Stump house. The most common theory, supported by fragments of evidence mentioned in official reports, suggested that the sisters had engaged in some form of folk healing practice that had gradually evolved into something more sinister. The region's tradition of power doctors, individuals who claimed supernatural abilities to heal through various rituals, was well established in Ozark culture, and several elderly residents interviewed decades later recalled that the Walker women's mother had been known locally as a skilled yarb woman, herbalist, before her death. This connection to traditional healing practices gained further support in 1934. When a historian researching Ozark folk medicine discovered a small, handwritten booklet of remedies attributed to Minerva Walker, the sisters' mother. The booklet, preserved by a former neighbor, contained conventional herbal treatments alongside increasingly unusual preparations. The final pages described methods for extracting what was termed vital humors from animals to create medicines of extraordinary potency. These preparations required that the animals be alive during the initial extraction process to ensure the humors remained animated by life force. While such practices would be considered cruel by modern standards, they existed within a historical context where the suffering of animals was often given little consideration, especially when weighed against human medical needs. Dr. Harrison Faulkner, a physician from Harrison who had been called to examine the bone fragments found in the Stump house, wrote in his medical journal, portions of which were published posthumously in 1927, that the sisters appeared to have been conducting anatomical investigations of a primitive but methodical nature. He noted that the fragments showed evidence of precise cutting and scraping rather than the breaking patterns typical of animal predation or accidental injury. More disturbingly, He observed that some bone fragments showed signs of having been boiled, while others appeared to have been treated with some type of preservative solution. Faulkner's journal also mentioned a curious device found among the sisters' possessions, a contraption of glass tubes, metal valves, and a hand-pumped bellows, which he believed was designed to collect and condense vapors or fluids. He speculated that this apparatus, crude but ingenious, might have been used in the preparation of medicines or tinctures. However, he noted with evident discomfort that certain modifications to the device suggested it could have been used to collect effluvia from organic materials during processes of decay, a practice associated with some of the more esoteric and discredited branches of early medical experimentation. The most comprehensive attempt to understand what occurred at the Walker Stump House came in 1952, when anthropologist Martin Blackwood from the University of Arkansas conducted interviews with several elderly residents who had lived in the area during the period in question. His findings, published in the Journal of Ozarks Studies in 1954, suggested that the Walker sisters had been practitioners of a syncretic belief system that combined elements of traditional Ozark folk magic with concepts possibly derived from medical texts that their father, who had briefly served as an orderly in a field hospital during the Civil War, might have brought into the household. Blackwood's research uncovered that Josiah Walker had developed an obsession with the preservation of life after witnessing the deaths of countless young men during the war. According to accounts from those who knew him, Josiah had been particularly affected by the amputation procedures common during the conflict, often speaking of his distress at seeing vital parts discarded while the men who lost them sometimes survived. This experience, Blackwood theorized, may have led to Josiah's unorthodox ideas about the nature of life and where exactly within the human body the vital spark resided. These ideas apparently intensified following the death of his wife. Several neighbors recalled that Josiah had refused to permit her burial for nearly a week, keeping the body in the cabin and applying various preparations to it in what seemed to be an attempt at preservation. When authorities finally insisted on proper interment, witnesses described Josiah as being in a state of agitation, claiming that he had been almost successful in some unspecified procedure that would have restored animation. It was shortly after this incident that he began the construction of the Stump House, apparently believing that the massive oak contained special properties that would aid in his ongoing research. Blackwood theorized that following their father's death, the sisters' isolation had led to an increasingly distorted worldview in which they believed they could extract and preserve what they called vital essences from living beings. These essences, according to fragments of writings recovered from the Stump House, were thought to contain healing properties that could prevent illness and extend life when properly processed and administered. Blackwood noted that similar beliefs had been documented in various isolated communities worldwide, often emerging independently as corruptions of more conventional medical or spiritual practices. One particularly disturbing aspect of Blackwood's research concerned local rumors that the sisters had been observed collecting soil from fresh graves in the county cemetery. While no official reports confirmed these activities, several individuals interviewed claimed to have witnessed one or more of the Walker women near the cemetery after dark, especially following burials. The prevailing theory was that they were gathering herbs that often grew in the disturbed soil of grave sites, a practice documented in some folk medicine traditions. However, at least 2 interview subjects suggested more unsettling possibilities, including the collection of death effluvia, believed by some practitioners to hold special properties. The most chilling aspect of Blackwood's research emerged from an interview with Eliza Thornton, who had been in her 20s in 1893 and had once delivered eggs to the Walker property. She recalled that the middle sister, Meredith, had shown her a collection of small bottles containing dark liquid, explaining that they were distillations of life force that would ensure the sisters would never know sickness or aging. Thornton also remembered Meredith commenting that the stronger the creature, the more powerful the essence, with human essence being most potent of all. Thornton admitted that at the time she had assumed this was merely strange talk from an eccentric woman, but in retrospect, the implications were deeply disturbing. Thornton's account included a detail she had never previously shared. During her visit, she observed that each sister wore an identical pendant containing what appeared to be a small amount of dark liquid sealed behind glass. Meredith had noticed her interest and explained that these contained their mother's concentrated essence, extracted as she lay dying, her final gift to her daughters. The pendants, Meredith claimed, protected them from illness and allowed their mother's wisdom to guide them. Thornton recalled that the way Meredith spoke about the pendants made her intensely uncomfortable, though she couldn't articulate exactly why at the time. The fate of the Walker sisters remains one of the enduring mysteries of Ozark history. No confirmed sighting of any of the three women was ever recorded after September 1893. However, between 1894 and 1897, reports emerged from several communities throughout the broader Ozark region of strange women matching their general description, always three, always dressed identically, passing through briefly before moving on. None of these reports led to apprehension, and by the turn of the century, such sightings had ceased entirely. One intriguing account came from a station master in Fayetteville who reported that in late October 1893, three women wearing heavy veils purchased tickets for a train headed toward Kansas City. He noted their transaction because they paid with an unusual collection of old coins, including several rare pieces that he kept as curiosities. When these coins were examined by a numismatist in 1967, they were determined to include several pieces from the 1830s that matched the description of a collection known to have belonged to Josiah Walker, reportedly passed down from his grandfather. In 1921, a surveyor working in a remote section of what is now the Buffalo National River area discovered a small cave containing human remains. Among the items found with the remains were three identical silver lockets, each containing a different lock of hair. County records confirmed that in 1876, Josiah Walker had purchased three such lockets from a jeweler in Harrison as Christmas gifts for his daughters. However, due to the deteriorated condition of the remains and the primitive forensic techniques available at the time, no definitive identification was ever made, and the case was never officially linked to the Walker sisters. The cave discovery included another element that was largely overlooked in official reports but mentioned in the surveyor's private correspondence with a colleague at the University of Arkansas. In the deepest part of the cave, beyond where the remains were found, he discovered a small chamber containing what he described as a shrine of sorts. This arrangement included a flat stone serving as an altar, upon which sat three glass containers partially filled with a black substance that had hardened over time. Surrounding this central feature was a series of markings carved into the cave walls, symbols that the surveyor could not identify but which he found reminiscent of anatomical drawings, yet distorted in a way that suggested something other than human. Perhaps the most unsettling postscript to the Walker-Stump house case emerged in 1968, when construction workers clearing land for a highway expansion near Eureka Springs uncovered a metal box buried approximately 3 feet underground. Inside was a journal, its pages badly damaged by moisture but portions still legible. County authorities determined that the handwriting matched samples known to belong to Imogene Walker, the youngest of the three sisters. The journal entries, covering a period from October 1893 to May 1894, contained fragmentary references to the sisters' flight from authorities and their struggle to establish a new location to continue what Imogene referred to as the work. The journal described how the sisters had moved frequently in the months following their escape from the Stump house, staying briefly in abandoned cabins, caves, and at one point, another hollowed tree stump they discovered deep in the forest. Imogene wrote of their continuing experiments, noting with increasing concern that without their equipment and materials left behind at the Stump House, their results were degenerating, and their preserved essences were losing potency. She described Evangeline, the eldest, as growing increasingly desperate, insisting that they needed a fresh subject to continue their research, while Meredith had begun experiencing what Imogene described as visitations, apparently hallucinations, in which she claimed their mother spoke to her, providing new insights into their work. The final legible entry, dated May 18, 1894, read in part, "M believes we must abandon the physical vessels. She says we have learned enough to transcend. E agrees. They are preparing the final distillation. I am afraid, but they insist the transformation will free us from all earthly limitations. If they are right, perhaps someday someone will read these words and understand that what we sought was not destruction, but its opposite, a perfect preservation of life's essence, a refusal to surrender to death's decay." What exactly the transformation entailed remains speculative, but certain passages in the journal hint at a ritual involving the consumption of concentrated essences that the sisters believed would allow their consciousness to exist independently of their physical bodies. Imogene described preparations for this ritual with evident trepidation, noting that Meredith had calculated the precise phase of the moon and alignment of stars necessary for success. The journal's final pages contain increasingly disjointed notes on these astronomical calculations, suggesting that Imogene's mental state was deteriorating as the appointed date approached. Following this discovery, historian Rebecca Thornton, granddaughter of Eliza Thornton, who had been interviewed by Blackwood, conducted extensive research into similar cases throughout the Ozark region. Her findings, published in 1972, identified at least 7 other incidents between 1880 and 1910 involving isolated practitioners of unorthodox healing methods that had evolved into something darker. Thornton suggested that the economic hardship and geographic isolation common in the Ozarks during this period created conditions where traditional folk practices might become dangerously distorted, especially when combined with fragmentary medical knowledge divorced from its proper context. One case that Thornton found particularly relevant involved a man named Silas Abernathy who had lived alone in a remote cabin near the Missouri-Arkansas border around 1905. When Abernathy died, apparently of natural causes, neighbors who came to prepare his body for burial discovered dozens of glass jars containing preserved animal parts labeled with arcane symbols. More disturbing was a journal in which Abernathy had documented his attempts to create what he called a composite being by combining elements from various animals, a project he claimed was guided by instructions he had received from 3 women who visited him in dreams, always appearing identically dressed. Thornton also documented the case of Lucinda Marsh, a reclusive woman living near Batesville, Arkansas in the 1890s, who was found dead in her home surrounded by equipment remarkably similar to that described in the Walker sisters' Stump House. Investigation revealed that Marsh had been corresponding with someone signing their letters only as M.W., possibly Meredith Walker, who provided detailed instructions for extracting and preserving what the letters referred to as animating principles from various sources. The letters, preserved in the State Historical Archives, reveal an escalating pattern of experimentation that Thornton believed paralleled the Walker sisters' activities. The site where the Walker Stump House once stood remains identifiable today only as a slight depression in the forest floor, now overgrown with saplings and understory plants. Local residents still occasionally report unusual experiences in the vicinity: unexplained sounds after dark, sudden temperature drops, and an inexplicable sense of being observed. Wildlife seems to avoid the location, with game trails visibly diverting around the area rather than crossing it directly. While rational explanations likely exist for these phenomena, They continue to fuel local legends about the lingering influence of whatever transpired there in 1893. In 1988, a team from the University of Arkansas Department of Anthropology conducted a small-scale archaeological investigation of the site, hoping to find physical evidence that might clarify aspects of the historical record. Their excavation revealed the charred remains of the Stump's base, confirming its considerable size, nearly 16 feet in diameter. Among the ash and soil, they recovered several small artifacts that had survived the fire. A few glass fragments, likely from bottles or containers, metal fixtures including hinges, and what appeared to be parts of scientific instruments, and, most notably, several small bone fragments that testing confirmed were not human, but came from various animals. The most significant discovery was a small glass vial, its contents long since evaporated, hidden in what appeared to be a deliberately created cavity in the Stump's root system. The vial bore an engraved symbol matching those described in Sheriff Ledbetter's correspondence, a circle containing an intricate pattern resembling branching veins or roots. When this symbol was later compared to those documented in other cases of unorthodox practitioners throughout the region, researchers identified striking similarities, suggesting a shared iconography among these isolated individuals that had previously gone unnoticed. What actually happened inside the Walker sisters' Stump house may never be fully understood. The fragmentary evidence suggests a tragic progression from folk healing traditions into something much darker, a descent into madness, accelerated by isolation and misguided experimentation. The case stands as a somber reminder of how human curiosity, when divorced from ethical constraints and community oversight, can lead to unthinkable transgressions. The most thorough scholarly analysis of the case, published by Dr. Eleanor Hammond in the Journal of American Folklore in 1983, concluded, "The Walker Stump House incident represents a unique convergence of multiple Ozark traditions. The practical use of massive stumps as emergency shelters by early settlers, the rich heritage of folk healing practices, and the region's tradition of female practitioners who maintained health in isolated communities. That these beneficial traditions could transform into something so disturbing serves as a warning about the fragility of social norms in extreme isolation." Hammond's analysis included an often overlooked aspect of the case: the role of grief in potentially driving the sisters' descent into dangerous practices. She noted that the family had experienced multiple losses: first Minerva Walker, whose death profoundly affected her husband and daughters, then Josiah himself. Hammond suggested that these losses, combined with their increasing isolation, might have fueled an obsessive desire to conquer death itself, to find a way to preserve not just the body, but what they perceived as the essential life force that animated it. This theory gained support from entries in Imogene's recovered journal, where she repeatedly referenced her mother's death and described dreams in which Minerva appeared, seeming more present with each passing night. "Soon," she says, "we will achieve complete restoration, and death will have no further power over those we love." In 1969, an elderly woman being treated at the state hospital in Little Rock reportedly told her attending physician that she was Meredith Walker and that she and her sisters had completed the transformation in 1894, allowing them to move between worlds at will. Hospital records indicate that the woman, who had been admitted under the name Margaret Wilson, died 3 days after this confession. Imogene wrote, "Mother comes more clearly now. E says it is because the essence we have prepared is strengthening, allowing the pattern of her being to reassert itself. No documentation existed to either confirm or refute her claimed identity, and she was buried in an unmarked grave in the hospital cemetery." The attending physician, Dr. James Hollister, recorded detailed notes about his conversations with the woman claiming to be Meredith Walker. These notes, discovered among his personal papers after his death in 1982, describe a patient who was remarkably lucid despite her advanced age and physical frailty. She spoke with precise diction and used technical terminology consistent with late 19th century medical texts when describing the procedures she and her sisters had allegedly performed. Most disturbing to Hollister was her claim that she and her sisters had discovered that human consciousness could be decanted from one vessel to another through a process involving the extraction and consumption of specific neural tissues prepared according to a precise method. When asked about Joseph Hardin, the man who had disappeared near their property in 1893, the woman reportedly became agitated, insisting that they had helped him achieve transcendence, and that he had been the first success in their experiments. According to Hollister's notes, she claimed that Hardin's consciousness had been successfully preserved and later reintegrated into another form, though she was vague about what exactly this meant. Hollister noted that he found the woman's manner deeply unsettling, not because she appeared delusional, but because she conveyed these disturbing claims with a calm certitude that made him momentarily question his own rational dismissal of her story. Whether the Walker sisters met their end in that remote cave, successfully escaped to establish new identities elsewhere, or experienced some other fate remains unknown. What endures is the cautionary legacy of their Stump house, a reminder of how isolation and obsession can transform even the most benign traditional practices into something unrecognizable and monstrous. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case is how it reveals the thin line between healing and harm, how practices intended to preserve life can, through distortion and misapplication, become tools of destruction. In the shadowed interior of that hollowed oak stump, the Walker sisters apparently crossed that line, leaving behind only fragments of evidence about the precise nature of their transgression. In 1997, a geological survey team working in a remote area of the Buffalo National River Parkland discovered a series of small caves whose entrances had been largely obscured by a rockfall, estimated to have occurred at least 75 years earlier. Inside one of these caves, they found evidence of human habitation, including the remains of a crude hearth, fragments of glass containers, and most significantly, carvings on the walls that matched the symbols described in accounts of the Walker Stump house. The cave's remote location and difficult access suggested that its inhabitants had deliberately sought extreme isolation. Carbon dating of charcoal remains from the hearth indicated that it had last been used in the mid-1890s, coinciding with the period when the Walker sisters were fugitives. Most intriguing was the discovery of a small leather pouch containing 3 human teeth, each wrapped in a different colored thread, red, blue, and green, colors that Josiah Walker was known to have associated with his 3 daughters, according to accounts from neighbors. Whether this represented evidence of violence or some form of ritual significance remains unclear, as does the question of whether the cave was actually occupied by the Walker sisters or by someone else familiar with their practices. The forest has long since reclaimed the site where the Walker Stump house once stood. Yet something of its presence seems to linger in local memory, a persistent disquiet that resurfaces in each retelling of the story. Those who hike the trails near where the property once existed often report an inexplicable urge to move quickly through certain areas, a sudden sense of being unwelcome in spaces where the forest falls unnaturally silent. In 2008, a group of students from the University of Arkansas conducted an informal investigation at the site as part of a folklore project. They set up audio recording equipment overnight and later reported capturing unusual sounds, what they described as rhythmic chanting, at approximately 3 a.m., though audio experts who examined the recordings suggested the sounds were more likely attributable to wind effects or nocturnal wildlife. More difficult to explain were the students' unanimous reports of experiencing intense, identical nightmares the night following their visit, dreams involving 3 women in identical clothing who spoke to them in unison, offering to share the secret of undying. As with many dark chapters in history, perhaps the Walker Stump House case is best understood not merely as an isolated incident of human wrongdoing, but as a reflection of broader cultural anxieties about isolation, about the loss of traditional knowledge, about the boundaries between life and death that medicine and science continually challenge. In this sense, the hollow stump where the Walker sisters practiced their macabre arts serves as both historical footnote and potent metaphor. A space carved from living wood, transformed by human hands into something unnatural, where the ordinary rules of existence were suspended in pursuit of impossible preservation. Local historian Jeremiah Collins, who has extensively researched the case, observed in a 2015 presentation to the Ozark Historical Society, "What makes the Walker Stump House case continue to resonate is how it embodies our ambivalent relationship with both the past and progress." The sisters existed at a historical inflection point, trained in traditional folk practices being rapidly displaced by modern medicine, isolated in a region that was simultaneously being opened up by new transportation and communication technologies. Their response to these changes was to retreat further into isolation and pursue increasingly extreme versions of traditional practices, perhaps hoping to discover through excess what was being lost through obsolescence. The story of the Walker sisters has largely faded from public awareness, remembered now by only a handful of folklorists, local historians, and descendants of those who once lived in the shadow of their reputation. Yet in this forgetting lies perhaps the final tragedy. Not that such disturbing events occurred, but that their cautionary power has been lost, leaving open the possibility that similar transgressions might someday emerge again in places where isolation breeds distortion and obsession overcomes conscience. In 2019, a retired physician named Harold Ramsey came forward with a curious family heirloom, a small leather-bound book that had belonged to his grandfather, who had practiced medicine in the Ozarks in the early 1900s. The book contained handwritten formulae for various medicinal preparations, most of them conventional for the time. Most disturbing was an inscription on the inside cover: "Knowledge preserved from the sisters three, lest wisdom be lost to posterity." Ramsey reported that his grandfather had always kept the book locked away, and had warned him never to attempt any of the procedures it described, saying only that they had been obtained at great cost from practitioners whose methods were effective but unconscionable. For those who study the darker aspects of Ozark history, the Walker Stump House remains an enduring enigma, a hollow space not just in the physical world, but in our understanding, a darkness that continues to resist illumination more than a century after the events that transpired there. However, several pages near the end contain descriptions of procedures remarkably similar to those attributed to the Walker sisters, including methods for extracting what was termed neural essences from living subjects. In the end, perhaps it is this very incompleteness that makes the case so unsettling, the sense that we have glimpsed only the surface of something far more disturbing that remains forever, just beyond our full comprehension. In 2022, during renovation of an old farmhouse near Harrison, workers discovered a cache of glass vials hidden within a wall cavity. Each vial contained a dark residue and bore labels in faded ink, with dates ranging from 1892 to 1894. Analysis by forensic chemists determined that the residue contained organic compounds consistent with dried blood and neural tissue, preserved with a mixture of chemicals common to late 19th century embalming practices. Local authorities attempted to keep the discovery quiet, but rumors spread, reviving interest in the Walker sisters' case among those familiar with the region's history. In the words of Sheriff Ledbetter's final report on the case, filed in December 1893, "Some matters are perhaps best left unclarified, some questions best left unanswered. The Stump House has been reduced to ash, and it is my recommendation that no monument or marker ever be erected to commemorate what occurred there. Let the forest reclaim that ground, and let the passage of time dim the memory of those events in the minds of this community." And so it has come to pass. The Walker sisters and their Stump house have become little more than a footnote in regional history, occasionally revived in academic papers or mentioned in collections of Ozark folklore, but largely forgotten by the general public. Yet for those who encounter their story, something of its disquiet tends to linger, a reminder of what can emerge when human ingenuity is directed toward impossible goals in the shadows beyond community and conscience. A curious postscript to the case emerged in 2023, when a researcher at the Arkansas State Archives discovered a series of letters exchanged between Sheriff Ledbetter and officials at an asylum in St. Louis between 1894 and 1897. The correspondence revealed that Ledbetter had continued investigating possible sightings of the Walker sisters long after the official search was abandoned. In his final letter, dated March 1897, he wrote, "I am now convinced that we shall never apprehend these women, if indeed they still live in any conventional sense. What I have learned in pursuing this matter has convinced me that there are things in this world beyond ordinary understanding, and perhaps beyond the reach of human law. I shall make no further inquiries, and I suggest all records of this case be sealed." The asylum director's response, brief but equally cryptic, acknowledged receipt of an unspecified package from Ledbetter, with instructions that it be kept sealed and stored in their most secure location. No record exists of what this package contained, or whether it remains in storage to this day. The asylum itself was demolished in 1952, and what became of its records and stored items remains unknown. As the saying goes in the Ozarks, some trees are best left standing, some stumps best left unhollow, and some stories best left untold. But history, like nature, rarely honors such wishes completely. The traces remain for those who know where to look, in archived documents, in fragmentary physical evidence, and in the persistent local legends that continue to whisper about three sisters who sought to capture life's essence, and in doing so, lost their own humanity within the wooden walls of their Stump house. In October 2024, an elderly woman living in a nursing home in Springfield, Missouri, claimed shortly before her death that her grandmother had been a close friend of Imogene Walker. According to this woman, whose name was withheld by facility administrators, the Walker sisters had not perished in the 1890s, but had successfully carried out what they called the Great Work, a process that allowed them to transfer their consciousness into new bodies when their original forms grew old or infirm. She claimed that the sisters had continued their practices in secret for decades, moving between remote communities throughout the Ozarks and taking new identities as needed. While such claims are impossible to verify and likely represent the confused memories or fabrications of an aging mind, they contribute to the enduring mythos surrounding the Walker sisters, the sense that their story somehow continues, echoing through the hidden hollows and forgotten corners of the Ozark wilderness. Perhaps there is something in human nature that resists closure in such cases, a need to believe that not even death provides a definitive end to stories that disturb us deeply. Or perhaps, in some cases, the absence of closure reflects a deeper truth, that some boundaries, once crossed, lead to destinations from which there is no clear return, leaving behind only fragmented evidence and unanswerable questions that continue to haunt the imagination long after those who prompted them have passed from the world. As we conclude this journey into one of the Ozarks' darkest historical chapters, we are left to wonder what really happened in that hollowed stump on those autumn nights in 1893. Were the Walker sisters simply three disturbed women whose isolation and grief led them to unspeakable acts? Were they practitioners of forgotten knowledge that modern understanding cannot properly contextualize? Or were they, as some local legends still suggest, something else entirely, pioneers of a terrible transcendence that defies conventional categories of life and death? Whatever the truth may be, their story serves as a reminder of the shadows that exist at the edges of civilization, in the spaces where isolation allows human nature to evolve along paths untouched by social constraint or ethical oversight. In the heart of the seemingly idyllic Ozark wilderness, within the walls of a hollowed oak stump, three women once sought the secret of eternal life through methods that apparently cost others their lives, a cautionary tale about the price of pursuing immortality and the darkness that can emerge when obsession eclipses humanity.